Well, thank you all very much for having me and for being here. It is, I know, a wonderful day to be outside, but this is more important, learning about the Word of God and how it can direct how we should live our lives. I think I heard when he was introducing me a couple of people when he said a Christian politician. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but if you're like me, you said, what? I grew up in politics. I saw what it was like. It's not a fun thing to be involved in. It's dirty, it's nasty, it's important, and we are called to be a part of it. I think when I think about politics and when I think about living the Christian life, I think of Ezekiel. Because I believe that as Christians, we have been called to be watchmen to stand at the gate. We are called to warn society and speak our values into society as opposed to allow society to impose its value on us or its values on us. And when you think about Ezekiel 33, 6 and 7, it doesn't just say, Son of man, that I have appointed you to be a watchman for the people of Israel. And before you get any ideas, in the New Testament it says we are a peculiar people, a royal priesthood. That isn't just to the prophet Ezekiel, that is to all of us. And it just isn't to the people of Israel, it is to all of mankind. You seem to remember, I hope, that great commission that we are to go into all the world to preach the gospel. We have a responsibility to be a watchman at the gate, and it's kind of scary when you look back at 33:6. In Ezekiel 33:7, it calls us to be a watchman. In Ezekiel 33:6, it says, if that watchman does not speak, if he does not warn the people and they are taken, then it's upon them. Because of what they have done, they are taken. But I will hold their blood accountable to that watchman that did not speak. For the longest time in my life, I'm 43, I ran away from politics. I had been taught that politics isn't where you want to be as a believer. You want to be involved with being a good spouse. You want to be a good mother or father, in my case, obviously a father. And you want to be a good person in your community, being involved with your church and your schools and civic organizations. And I really concentrated on being a good husband to my wife. 13 years, I'm starting to learn a little bit. And to be a good father to my children. I have 4. David is 10, Samuel is 7, Elise is 4, and Benjamin turns a year next week. But I started to realize about 2 years ago that if I'm only worried about raising my children, about the school that they go to, about the church and the values that they are taught and that they internalize, but I'm not a part of making sure that the world outside of our house, that the world outside of their school and the church is not the world that is right for them to go out into, then I'm not doing my job. And I started to think about it, and I realized that I had accepted one of the great lies that I believe the deceiver has made when it comes to Christians in politics. There are really kind of 2 of them. One is that you don't belong in politics, that's not the place for Christians. And I had kind of believed that for way too long, focusing on my family and in other institutions. And the second is you have to be special. To be called by God, you have to be that special person, that you're arrogant if you think you're that special person and called to make a difference. And then I thought back to what it says in the New Testament. It calls us to be the salt of the earth. I don't know about you, I probably don't follow the guidelines that the federal government would give us on salt intake and how to use it. But I don't just put salt on the edge of my plate. I put it right in the middle and I stir it in. And I believe that that's what God meant when He called us to be the salt of the earth. He didn't call us to be, He said, you are. It wasn't a, hey, I'd like you to do this. It was a, you are. And if we truly are the salt of the earth, if we truly are His witness, if we truly are that watchman that is held accountable to speak the warning and to speak His truth, then it's not just in one area of life. It's not just in our schools or just in education or just where we work. And politics is part of that. The second thing I was concerned about, though, was this idea that, God calls special people, and, I have a healthy ego. I'm running for office. I must. But is it really me? Is it wrong for me to stand up and say, I'm called by God to do something? And the fallacy there was that I was placing the importance and the specialness on the person that was called. And when you start to think about it, he uses the foolish to confound the wise, and the weak to confound the strong. He doesn't call the equipped, he equips those he calls. And the importance isn't that you have to be a special person to be called by God, to be used by him in politics or in any area of life. The calling is special not because of the individual it's directed to. The calling is special because of who calls us. Think about that. If you're like me, far too often I've had opportunities and I've been scared, kind of like Moses. Remember Moses in the Old Testament? When he was called, he says, I don't know that I'm the right person. But when God calls us, the specialness of that is who calls us. And the authority and the ability and the sufficiency of he who calls us. So when I realized that, yes, if I'm saying no to God's direction to get involved in politics, it's not me logically thinking it out and doing the right thing. It's my pride getting in the way. It's my pride telling God, no, I'm not the right person for this. You've been telling me I need to do this, but I know better than you. Now, I know I'm the only person here that's probably ever told God that I know better than he does. But it's a real concern. My second child, Samuel, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think it was a time, I think God used it to teach me. My son Samuel is now 7 years old. For any mothers out there, you'll understand he's the child that my mother says I deserve. I had a full head of hair before he was born. When my wife was 20 weeks pregnant, I woke up to her screaming. I rushed her to the hospital. By the time she was in the emergency room, in a separate room to be helped, she was unconscious. Samuel's heart rate was at 50. Well, we didn't have a name for him at the time. If you do the math, 20 weeks is halfway through a normal pregnancy. My wife had been thinking about calling him Jonathan because our first son is David, and she loved the story of the friendship between David and Jonathan in the Bible. But we get to the hospital, his heartbeat is about 50, should be, 180 to 220. For 5 weeks, the doctors told us there was nothing they could do, that my wife was going to go into labor within the next 24 hours and our child was going to die. You might think that's a really difficult time. But what it taught me, and I believe that God was teaching me, was he was teaching me not to rely upon myself. I have degrees in engineering. I think I know a lot. I know nothing about medicine. And far too often when I encounter a problem, I try to change it. I try to fix it instead of looking to God and saying, God, you created the world. You took dust that you had created, breathed life into it, and made me. Maybe you know best how to solve this. At 25 weeks, my son Samuel was born. They had been following him. They had been providing medical care to my wife for 5 weeks. They were doing ultrasounds weekly, multiple times a week, and they said, you know what? He's going downhill. Hopefully he's going to be alive. He's going to be blind. He's going to have cerebral palsy or something else like this. But we've got to do what we can do. At 25 weeks, my son was 1.25 pounds. If you go to McDonald's and get their hamburgers, that would be 5 of the patties. Don't include the buns or the relish or the pickles or the mayo or anything like that. He fit entirely in my hand. My wife's wedding ring, and she is a petite young lady, not much smaller than I am. We could take her wedding ring and put his hand through it and take it up to his shoulder. But he wasn't blind. He didn't have cerebral palsy. He breathed on his own in the room where they did the emergency surgery. And now he's 7 years old. He'll be the death of me. But he is an awesome, wonderful, independent human life because of God. Think about that. The doctors for weeks said there's nothing we can do. The people with the training, with years of experience who had seen this before. If God can do that, then he can take someone like me and he can equip me and use me to make sure that the values that should be are transmitted from one generation to the next. And the values of the Bible are imposed upon government instead of government imposing its values upon us. And the great lesson that I learned there, my wife would agree that I'm a slow learner sometimes. It's been 13 years. The lesson that I still have to keep learning, and you all laugh, but some of you, I bet, have the same problem, is I know that God's in charge, but leaving it with him to actually let him be in charge. And when I got into politics, I was so concerned. I'm an engineer. I don't walk into a room of people and want to say hello. I want to check the beams. I want to make sure that the walls aren't going to come down. I'm interested in the trusses that they used. And I realized, how does God use me? But what I think is maybe the second most important teaching of the Bible is this. What are we called to do? As humans, I think far too often, and I will say this is only me, although some of you might agree that it happens in your life. I think that far too often we think that we are called to results. I think that we are called to outcomes. I mean, that's normal. That's how society works. I talked to some pastors, I guess it was earlier this week, I lose track. And if you're a pastor, I assume that one of the things you worry about is how many people are there every Sunday. And what the collections are. And those are natural, normal things to think about. But I don't think the Bible calls us to that. When I read the Bible, I see a Bible that says to seek the will of God. And then do the will of God. And if we do that, he's responsible. Don't you think there are times in life where if you just, it's hard to do at times, when you're going through that difficult time, when you're working in an area that you say, I'm being stretched, isn't that a magical, amazing, tremendous thought? I'm just called to obedience, to do God's will, and he is responsible for the outcome. He who knows the best outcome, who knows my life and yours from the beginning to the end as an open book before we were ever born. He who is faithful, who will never leave us nor forsake us, he is responsible for that outcome. And as I've moved into the political realm, I think that so many people are stopped from being involved because they're concerned that it's not the place of Christians there. I'm here to tell you it is. We are the conscience of the world. We are the watchmen. We are the salt of the earth. We are to go into every part preaching his word. And then I think the second concern people have is that they can't do it. You all have clearly found out I'm not a great orator. You can laugh. It's okay. I got a big ego. But it's true. But that's not what's important. God doesn't need great statesmen. He doesn't need great men of whatever ability you want to give it. He needs men like Samuel that will listen for the call and will say, "Speak, Lord, thy servant is listening." And I would encourage you to get involved in the political realm, to be involved in deciding how our government will act, Because frankly, religious freedom's under attack. You can see that everywhere you look. Look to our neighbors to the north in Canada, where pastors are getting in trouble for what they say in their sermons. Can you imagine that? Look in California, where they've now passed a law that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld, saying that pregnancy crisis centers must give out information about how people may get abortions. We have a government that is mandating that people of faith contradict that faith by not standing up for life. I mean, what does John 10:10 say? I have come that you might have life, and that you might have life more abundantly. If that is why Christ came, should not government emulate that? That individuals might have life and that they might have it more abundantly? You know, Satan likes to say, just do it. And I'm not making fun of Nike. I don't mean it that way at all. Do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. There are no consequences. As Christians, we know that as the lie it is. You know, if it doesn't matter what you do, you are inconsequential. But as Christians, we are created. The Spirit of God was breathed into us that we might have life, if you remember in Genesis. We are given free will not because we are inconsequential, but because we are consequential, because that's what makes our actions matter. And I just beseech you to get involved in government and politics and every aspect of life. There cannot be that which is religious and that which is not. Because either what you believe is at your core or you believe something else. If what we believe, if our religious beliefs are not so at the core of everything we do, then we don't have what we think we have on the throne of our lives. And let me tell you, regardless of what people say, if you seek the will of the Father and you do the will of the Father, whether or not you see the outcomes you expect to have, the right outcomes will occur because God is responsible. It's right up there with what Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. I just want to thank you for allowing me to be here and to talk about the role of Christians in politics and in government. Because I think at this juncture in time, where your ability to believe what you want to believe and have your own conscience is violently under attack, and we need individuals to stand up, not in anger, but in love, with meekness and truth, to say, this is what God has said. I will stand on it. I cannot but think of Paul, who said, you be the judge of whether we should obey God or man. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.